So being reflexive means worrying about really difficult questions. Let's say climate change has been now made into a story that's there every day and in all media across the world. Is this really such a unique and distinct problem that humanity is facing? Especially now that we have COVID going on. Maybe we are past the peak, maybe not, because new mutations are evolving and that some are resistant to the vaccine, which is supposed to be the savior, and so on. So, of course, you can think of other issues as well that can completely dominate the existence for a while. And that, of course, conflicts with action on climate change, protests, the demand for policies, this and that and the other thing. The book argues that artificially a narrow subset of climate and development issues may have encouraged both scientists and policymakers to focus on the perceived imperative of limiting climate change to within certain bounds, rather than on development goals that are more fundamental from a more humanitarian perspective. At the same time, policy targets that have been framed in terms of development and human rights, I will show the Sustainable Development Goals in the next slide, have limited the scope for leverage and integration with climate policy. So SDGs are holistic and very good goals for humanity as a whole, but it's not easy to synergize those necessarily with all the climate change targets or action plans, adaptation, mitigation plans, and so on. So we could be developing two parallel streams that are related and yet cannot be brought together necessarily or easily. Many aspects of adaptation are generic and should be included in action-oriented analysis of climate change. In addition to all these projections, it should be possible, for example, to assess the feasibility and cost of different measures to conserve water or increase year-round water supplies in regions where per capita freshwater resources are declining, or to quantify the viability of different options for enhanced coastal defenses in areas where sea level rise presents threats to habitation. Indeed, we suspect that the magnitude of these adaptation costs for high-end warming scenarios may provide the most important and persuasive argument for climate change mitigation. Persuasive arguments, right? In other words, how do we portray the climate change problem in terms of policies, need for action, and priorities and opportunities? This is not always easy. And most damning statement is, in particular, the idea that climate change as a physical phenomenon is unique and distinct or uniquely dangerous in its impacts on human activities is both counterproductive and wrong. Okay, how many climate scientists would even agree with this, right? Just to run through the Sustainable Development Goals, it has no poverty, zero hunger, good health, well-being, quality education, gender equality, and so on, out to peace, justice, strong institutions, partnerships for the goals. Obviously, for example, reduced inequalities. Already we know that climate change is creating winners and losers. The impacts are disparate. They are not the same across. Global South is facing more problems because of the warm temperatures and the way convection, rainfall, sea level rise, cyclones, etc. respond to warming. Plus, they are not the major contributors to global warming historically, so they are paying a price. So it is related to global warming, climate change, but how do you merge the goals of sustainable development process and climate change projection, UNFCCC process, Paris Agreement, and so on? That's not always so obvious, okay? How to put costs on things. So this is talking about adaptation again from the Global Commission on Adaptation, which adopted this figure from the World Resources Institute. Without going into detail, it uses economic models to argue about cost-benefit ratios for investments in climate adaptation. Okay, we will see that evaluating climate impacts is not easy because there are non-market value goods, there are cultural impacts, places lost that have cultural values and so on, that cannot be put in this kind of framework. Nonetheless, strengthening early warning systems. This is important for countries like India, China, Africa, South America, continents, of course, because they are going to allow people to deal with climate impacts and extreme events, heat waves, floods, droughts already in terms of sub-seasonal or less than 3-month time scale to seasonal multiple season time scales like El Nino, Madden-Julian oscillation, monsoon intraseasonal oscillation, active break periods, etc. And that translates into health and energy, agriculture, water resources, and so on. Making new infrastructure resilient. Obviously, there are net benefits for each of these in this economic evaluation, and there are various details involved there. Like these are net benefits illustrating the approximate global net benefits to be gained by 2030 from an illustrative investment of $1.8 trillion in 5 areas. These are the 5 areas. Okay. As we said, there are many assumptions involved. Will this convince people to act? Maybe. Improving dryland agriculture and crop production. This is a good goal by itself. Doesn't necessarily have to be about global warming and climate change. This is just to keep food security for a population that is still increasing, may decrease at some point, but is still increasing. And then acidification has to be looked at as a climate impact on top of this. Protecting mangroves. Natural defenses, carbon sequestration, habitats, oxygen, cultural values, etc. Right? Making water resource management more resilient. Again, a problem that can be not necessarily about climate change, but a good social plan anyways. Okay? So there are limits of science in defining dangerous anthropogenic interference, as I will talk about in the coming podcast, next podcast. But you get the idea that just framing the climate change itself as part of a broader portfolio of problems that humanity is facing, and it is not a common problem. Increasing CO2 is a global problem. Governing global concentrations of CO2 may be a global governance problem. But when it comes to adaptation and reducing impacts in terms of water resources, dryland agriculture, mangrove losses, livelihood losses associated with those, and so on, they can be done independently and they can be merged with other sustainable development goals, resilience against weather disasters anyways. Okay,